Good afternoon. Today, we made a decision to raise the key rate by 25 basis points to 4.5% per annum. The economy is reviving more steadily now, and both domestic and external demand is growing. However, inflationary pressure has intensified and pro-inflationary risks have increased. In these conditions, we are beginning to return to neutral monetary policy. As a result, this will bring back annual inflation to our target, close to 4% in the first half of 2020. I would like to dwell on the factors behind the decision we have made today. First, the steady components of annual inflation and current price growth in annualized terms are considerably above 4%. This is the evidence of elevated inflationary pressure across a wide range of products. Such acceleration of price growth has been driven by both demand and supply-side factors. Last year, consumer demand had a disinflationary impact, while now it is becoming pro-inflationary as demand is expanding. The epidemic situation in Russia is improving, vaccination is underway, and authorities are lifting restrictions. People are gradually returning to their normal life, making purchases they postponed before. This is evident from an increase in the sales of household appliances, electronics, and home improvement goods, and the rise in the demand for leisure and travel. Moreover, the funds that were earlier spent on outbound tourism have been recently used predominantly inside Russia. Demand is bouncing back steadily, while the recovery of supply will require more time. It is impossible to restore production and supply chains instantly, especially given the restrictions still in place locally. Companies will need time to adjust their business plans to a faster recovery of demand, find additional suppliers, employ staff, and expand output. A very good example is domestic tourism. The shift in the overall tourism flow has happened quite fast and unexpectedly. The tourism segment did not have sufficient infrastructure for that, which has affected pricing. One-off factors have exacerbated inflation rates and expectations that are elevated even without this influence. Food price growth sped up the most. The measures implemented by the government have helped smooth out these price rises partially. The elevated growth rate of prices for basic goods is especially important for consumers and considerably increases inflation expectations. As a result, the steady component of price growth may rise for a prolonged time. We can see that household inflation expectations are currently above pre-pandemic levels, although they have lowered as compared to the peak recorded in December. It is necessary to prevent further inflation acceleration. Therefore, inflation expectations need to be reduced as soon as possible. Overall, the balance of factors has shifted towards pro-inflationary ones. Second, economic growth exceeds expectations and is becoming steadier. This is driven by the rebound of both domestic and external demand. External demand promotes Russian exports, specifically of metals, chemicals, and food. High-frequency indicators suggest that economic activity and employment are growing. Consumer demand has been recovering steadily since the end of 2020. The demand for durable goods has been rising. As more households are improving housing conditions, this is boosting the demand for accompanying goods, including tools, construction materials, furniture, and household appliances. The demand for cars also remains high. All this supports output in respective industries. Many of them have already restored their output or even increased above pre-pandemic levels, including in the manufacture of furniture and household appliances, clothing and fabrics, fertilizers, paints and varnishes, agricultural machinery, and electric equipment. The service sector, hardest hit by the pandemic, continues to recover, which is evidenced by high-frequency indicators proving that business activity in services has improved considerably. We expect further economic growth. The upward trend will be supported by vaccination and the extension of a part of preferential government programs. Fiscal policy will remain expansionary throughout 2021 as compared to the parameters provided for by the fiscal rule. Third, monetary conditions remain accommodative. Moreover, yields on federal government bonds have risen since the Board of Directors' previous meetings on the key rate. The increase in short-term yields was driven by the expectations that the Bank of Russia will shift towards neutral monetary policy earlier and faster. Medium and long-term yields on federal government bonds were primarily influenced by rising interest rates in global financial markets. Nonetheless, nominal interest rates on loans and deposits have not changed significantly. Monetary conditions will remain accommodative until the key rate returns into the neutral range, which is still from 5% to 6% according to our estimates. And this will continue to support lending, the annual growth rate of which is currently close to its several-year high. Monetary conditions are considerably impacted by the preferential lending programs implemented by the government. They are easing monetary conditions even more, and the extent of this influence depends on the scale of programs, the amounts of subsidies, and the maturities of credit instruments they cover. When their scale is significant, this implies that the central bank has to maintain tighter conditions for everyone. This is needed for average monetary conditions across the economy to ensure the level of aggregate demand corresponding to the goal of achieving the inflation target. This is the reason why we believe it essential to terminate comprehensive anti-crisis programs supporting lending after the country overcomes the acute phase of the economic crisis. We also insist that any permanent programs should only be limited and targeted. Otherwise, they will be paid for not only by the budget, but also by the major part of the economy, which will face higher interest rates. I will now speak on the factors that may significantly impact inflation on the longer run. These are predominantly pro-inflationary ones. Speaking of external demand factors, accommodative monetary policies and fiscal stimuli in advanced economies may encourage a faster recovery of the global economy than expected today. On the other hand, the demand for Russian exports will expand, which will bring additional revenues to exporters and have an upward impact on domestic demand. On the other hand, the growth of global prices in commodity markets may speed up. Consequently, this may involve the risk that this growth will translate into the trends of respective domestic prices. We are already observing this in the food segment. As regards domestic demand, consumption may be expanding even faster, including in services, exceeding the recovery pace of output. We can also identify pro-inflationary supply-side risks that are primarily caused by increased output costs. Moreover, a range of industries are already experiencing staff shortages, which may hinder the expansion of output. As before, the further development of the epidemic situations worldwide is highly uncertain. A range of countries are tightening restrictions again and partially suspending economic activity. Geopolitical risks remain elevated as well, and they may affect yield trends and inflation and exchange rate expectations. The Bank of Russia will also factor in how our medium-term forecast may be influenced by possible government decisions on investing into the National Wealth Fund's resources. Disinflationary factors have weakened but still exist. First of all, it is yet unclear how fast countries will be reopening boundaries after the pandemic recedes. In a situation where boundaries are fully reopened, households may be realizing the pent-up demand for foreign travels very fast. As a result, demand will be transferred to external markets. This will weaken inflationary pressure. I would like to remind you that before the outbreak of the pandemic, expenses for outbound tourism approximated 2 trillion rubles a year. However, if people remain cautious about foreign travel, a substantial portion of households' funds will remain inside Russia. It is now difficult to say which of the two options will become the reality. Furthermore, the reopening of boundaries will restore labour migrant flows and logistic chains, which will decrease inflationary pressure caused by companies' input costs. And in conclusion, I would like to comment on the shift towards neutral monetary policy. We have seen that the money market and the bond market have already included a potential key rate increase into asset prices. Nonetheless, a large number of experts and analysts assume that the Bank of Russia would begin to raise the key rate slightly later. However, the data available proves that we need to start returning to neutral monetary policy already now. Time really matters. If we delay a key rate increase, inflation may go up and inflation expectations will not lower. Inflation will deviate from the target even more, and consequently we will need to increase the key rate more significantly in the future. Rephrasing a popular expression, I would say that we have put the right comma in the phrase, to preserve impossible to raise. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I am ready to answer your questions. The first one comes from Elena Fabricna, Reuters. Has the central bank during the board meeting considered the option of raising the rate by more than 25 basis points, and whether normalization of the policy be finished before the end of 2021? We considered as one of the options a possible decision to raise the rate by more than 25 basis points. Basically, we considered three options: to keep it at ease, to raise it by 25, as well as by 50 basis points. Various arguments have been mentioned for and against it, and the reason we believe that one should do this step up at 25% lag, we think that there should be a more gradual change of our fiscal policy, well, monetary policy. And as far as the normalization of the policy may finish before the end of the year, in many ways that will be defined by the way things evolve, because there is still too many uncertainties remaining, like I've mentioned. So we will be looking at the data coming. We will update our outcomes considering the lag of the monetary policy. An important thing is the way we're going to review our outlook, and of course a set of conditions and prerequisites may stack up in such a way that it will be necessary, but it is not a given that this will be necessary to be done this year. This is not something which is predetermined. Next question comes from Anastasia Sevilla from Interfax, please. Good afternoon. My first question is as follows. You took out your inflation outlook from your press release, saying that it will come back to the target in the first half year. So to which extent do you believe inflation this year will exceed your previous forecast, which is 3.7, 4.2%? And what kind of inflation you would expect at the peak, 5.8? Is it a peak already, or it can be higher? The second thing, you said that in April you will publish the key rate trajectory, and so most probably that will definitely be some sort of a range. So how that range may look like, so how broad it may turn out to be, maybe you have already made up your mind. And the third, very important issue about communication. The market, until the last minute, was looking forward to see the rate to stay the same. Just some of the market players, against some of the rumors seeping out, started changing their expectations. So effectively, it's like back in 2018, we had a situation after which many market players were really having a critique in terms of that they were expecting that things would remain the same, and you took the rate up. So why didn't you basically try and let us know? You had almost a week, and so what do you think about there being various unofficial statements a long time before the board meeting? Thank you. So these are three questions, and so I will try and answer all of them by order of appearance. As far as the forecast of the future inflation is concerned, yes, we have reviewed it, and so currently we expect the inflation to come back to our target, which is 4% in the first half of 2022. Now, as far as the forecast of inflation towards the end of this year is concerned, we will disclose it in April, because in April we have a core meeting, and so we will update the whole of our outlook. But currently I can tell you that based on our estimates, towards the end of the year, inflation is going to be below the current values, but the range most probably will be broader than our target, which is 4%. Now, and as far as the peak point is concerned, based on our current consideration, we are somewhere close to the peak levels, somewhere around it. And so we stem from the expectation that in April inflation will gradually start coming down, so the annual inflation will start reducing, first and foremost because of the effect of the base. And as far as publishing the rate trajectory, just wait a little bit more, be patient. There's not much time left to wait, because in April we will present it. In any case, that would be, a graphic visual of the range. Now, in terms of the market expectations, we do see that the market, speaking about the financial market specifically, allowed for and was even expected possible rate raise during this board meeting, and we'll definitely be expecting the rates to grow even more before the end of the year. And many analysts, not all, but quite a few analysts, thought differently. And in our disclosures and during our interview before the week of silence, we underscored a considerable growth of the stable inflation components. But the decision itself hasn't been predetermined, had not been before the board was convened, because decisions made during the board meeting, and we analyzed the way things may go and whatever could impact the future economics and dynamics, and so the decision was being made as part of the board of directors' agenda. But I would like to emphasize that even considering the government bond curve, that was very much in line with the market expectations, because to us the most important thing is for the decision to be a timely one and a correct one. And once again, the decision hasn't been predetermined. It was being debated during the meeting, and there were three options, like I said. Amongst them, one possible option was to keep the rate as it was. Thank you. The next question from Anastasia Saprikina from RIA Novosti. The Bank of Russia today raised the key rate and said that it allows for the key rate growing during the subsequent meetings. Doesn't the central bank expect that this may bring about the slowing in the lending rates and the economic recovery? No, we don't expect this to happen, because our policy, monetary terms, shall remain accommodative, considering the time lags that manifest themselves always in the monetary policy implementations. And in any case, unless we enter into the neutral rate range, which, by the way, once we are in it, our decisions would also be taking place with a lag, so we do not believe that that might slow down the lending rate and the economic recovery. We do see that the lending rate is demonstrating very stable indicators, and the economy continues to recover. And the second question from Anastasia Saprikina. Now, bearing in mind the advanced recovery of the Russian economy, what kind of growth rate it may demonstrate towards the end of 2021 once it rebounds back to the pre-crisis level? Well, in terms of our outlook, with respect to the GDP growth, we will further update it in April. We expect that the growth shall sustain, and we also believe that it will come back to the pre-crisis level before the end of this year, the economics. Next question from Andrei Burikov, Bloomberg. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. Could you please tell us what we believe? Will the currency acquisitions may change as part of the fiscal rule because of the Ministry of Finance planning in the first half to invest money from the National Welfare Fund, and to what extent the currency acquisitions may be shortened this year. Well, the National Welfare Fund will be doing the acquisitions. I mean, the Minister of Finance, in accordance with the fiscal rule, now investing the money from the National Welfare Fund is something that we're going to monitor and mirror. But it's premature for us to comment because the final decision has been made. Too many uncertainties. Will act in accordance with the government resolution. Next question comes from Roman Markalo from the Russian Gazette. The current spike of inflation in Russia primarily is of a non-monetary nature. Is the Bank of Russia planning for a better price stability in the future to establish the instruments and the toolkits in order to reduce the volatility of such an inflation? What kind of solutions or instruments these might be? Apart in order to eliminate the seasonal inflation in the past, the Bank of Russia paid a lot of attention to the development of the vegetable storage infrastructure. How are things are there, and why any additional improvements have been shelved? Well, of course, we don't continuously monitor what happens to the non-monetary factors. Conditionally speaking, non-monetary factors are the ones on the side of the supply, and the monetary ones which are on the side of the demand. And the Bank of Russia is particularly in the place to influence whatever influences the demand. So the Bank of Russia doesn't have the tools in order to impact the non-monetary inflationary factors, amongst which, for example, there's a tax policy, competition policies, industrial development policy, etc. So at this point in time, we do ascertain that apart from the one-off factors, including the non-monetary ones, the growing of inflation is also related to the monetary stable component, as a result of which we arrived at this decision. As regards the vegetable depots, the vegetable warehouses, some time ago we emphasized the importance of this infrastructure, the availability of good infrastructures to stock the vegetables, and identified certain problematic points about it which are of non-monetary nature, apparently. But because that particular drawback led to a serious seasonal fluctuation of prices for vegetables, that provoked the growth in the inflationary expectations, and through that it affected the demand itself. Therefore, it was very important not to allow for such a seasonal volatility because of the lack of the warehousing facilities. So the Ministry of Agriculture really looked seriously into that, and the government support was made available. And according to the views on the part of the Ministry of Agriculture, there are no shortages because it's all about not about the quantities but about the qualities as well. So overall, throughout Russia, there may be certain local problems emerging, but that can be dealt with. So from the point of view of the problem of storing such food items in the light of seasonal volatility that may affect the price dynamics, indeed that problem in many ways lost its validity, because the problems that we observed this year, they were related not to the system of storing and warehousing, but to the system of manufacturing, producing, and the global market environments. The next question comes from Dmitry Butrin from Kommersant. What are the central bank's expectations as to the standard of savings dynamics in 2021-22? To what extent the central bank's decision to raise the key rate may affect the saving standard? Well, in 2020, the saving standard grew. We notice it, we took it into account, and we believe that throughout 2021, the saving standard will gradually diminish closer to the pre-pandemic levels of 2019, and of course we took account of it when deciding on the key rate. specifically that partially the motivation towards a better saving with the way the situation improves could move more into the background, and the households would be more keen to spend money for their usual consumption, and that may affect the inflation dynamics. But of course, that would depend upon the way things would evolve and how households' preferences change throughout the COVID situations in terms of the savings and consumption, the structure of consumption. That continues ongoing monitoring. The next question comes from Artur Auriciunu from Forbes. Good afternoon, my question is as follows. Recently, Mr. Sulanov, the Minister of Finance, said that in case additional sanctions are imposed upon the Russian sovereign debt, he would rely upon the domestic investors in order to compensate for the Russian budget deficit. So will the central bank be in a position to provide such a liquidity? And overall, what do you think about the possibility of the US sanctions upon the Russian sovereign debt? And the second question is, the government continued to monitor the prices and even assigned the person responsible for it. And so in case something happens, these responsible entities are going to be called upon to provide assistance. But the central bank hasn't been mentioned. Has it been discussed with you? And what generally do you think about this particular set of measures? Thank you very much for your questions. As far as us providing our liquidity is concerned, we are ready. We've got all the necessary instruments in order to provide liquidity to the banking industry, irrespective of, where the banking sector is going to subsequently apply this liquidity. You know that during the pandemic, there occurred structural changes in liquidity related, amongst other things, to the fiscal operations, because we saw this roller coaster. And you also remember how well in demand our mechanisms were in providing long-term liquidity. But, for example, as the budget continued to started funding its own spending after the period when, in an advanced way, it would borrow from the market, and that led to the banks demonstrating stronger demand for the central bank liquidity. And so afterwards, once the fiscal spending started again, that money came back to us. And so we believe that we should keep these instruments. They're quite enough. There's no need for any special arrangements, because in no way we expect any purpose-specific liquidity provision, because this is a general liquidity. So we shall continue to offer the monthly and annual repo instrument. But overall, I should say that there is enough liquidity in the market, because the industry right now is in surplus, and the surplus is somewhere about 1,800,000,000,000. And what regards the US sanctions with respect to the sovereign debt, I mean, this is something that continuously being discussed, and we've been at it for quite a few times. If there are such sanctions, there might be short-term liquidity fluctuations, but overall, our sovereign debt level is, very low according to the international standards, one of the lowest ones. And the fact that the respective fiscal policy is being pursued, and the sovereign debt is continuously in the controlled area, that doesn't create any financial stability risks. In any case, we have all the necessary instruments in order to be able to, manage the situation with the volatility in the financial market. As far as the continuous price monitoring is concerned, generally speaking, it's a very useful, very good thing. We monitor prices. We know that the government is also, following the prices in terms of the price levels in different industries and the type of different products and assortments. It is very important, although there are certain points related to every government agency, based on the price monitoring results in their area, may suggest various economic regulation measures. I mean, it's good that the economic regulation it is, rather than the administrative one, because I do say that certain additional explanation may be required, because if all of a sudden economic regulatory measures are adopted, which may affect business projects of various enterprises that may create a lot of uncertainty. So you do have to have some predictability so that such economic regulatory measures won't dramatically change the economics of the projects that businesses are running. And so predictability for businesses is of a principal importance. But in case of any pronounced and long-term price fluctuations and price growth, it is important to be able to have a set of activities that one could launch, which would enable one to balance the market out, and that would be really very useful to consumers, because whenever such a price growth is beginning, people are quite negative about it, and understandably why. Next question comes from Elvira Russia 24. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. The Federal Reserve gave us to understand that the rate is going to remain low until 2024. And this particular attitude points to them being quite hesitant and cautious in terms of the post-COVID recovery. How does the central bank view this particular policy? Yes, we do see that very large-scale stimuli package, and so initiating a new stimulus program against the economic recovery led to a review of long-term inflation risks on the part of the financial market, and as a consequence, a higher yield at the long end of the U.S. government debt curve. At the same time, seeing so many borrowers who are overloaded by debt, that may create risks to financial stability and may place the regulators in front of a choice to choose in between the inflationary risk or the financial stability risks. To us, in such an eventuality, it may mean that we may enter into the period of a higher volatility of capital flows into the emerging economies. And we always underscored in all of our reviews that this outflow-inflow capital factor and the possible volatility is one of the vulnerabilities of this market. So we are scrutinizing and monitoring the situation, always keeping close at hand various instruments which may help us to alleviate any risks ensuing from such volatility. The next question comes from Ekaterina Soroleva, Mordov Media. The annual inflation in Russia grew up to 5.67%, which is above what we heard in the previous forecast by the central bank. What is defining this inflation growth in the first place? Well, this inflation growth is defined by a set of factors, both on the side of the demand as well as on the side of supply. Once again, let me emphasize, we do see that the demand is recovering in a very stable way, and various macroeconomic indicators point to it. Now, the demand is also rebounding, but slower, which is conditioned by one-off negative factors, by the need for the manufacturing chains to recover, as well as because of imperfect competition in separate market sectors. We also see as the factor, that the demand entered into such a modality of a stable recovery that eased to manufacturers and suppliers and retailers the ability to reflect the previous high costs in their current prices. Yes, certain temporary effects are also visible on the side of the supply, like the lower crop yield, then the export issues, and we saw it as the result of dramatic and abrupt hikes for the sugar and sunflower. Currently, this is eggs and potatoes. Yes, there is a very strong influence coming from the one-off factors, which is prevailing in the way the current inflation rates look high, but also the share of the stable inflation components also grows, and that is why we made up our mind today to raise the rate. Thank you. Next question comes from Evgeny Belyakov from the Komsomolskaya Pravda. The main reason for the key rate being risen by the central bank is the inflation becoming speedier. What else is required, because the government decided to prohibit the price rise for the socially important goods? So what do you think about this particular solution? Well, my opinion is that the administrative prohibitions is the measure. Once applied, it's an extreme one, and it may remain in place only for a short-lived period. It may produce a similarly short-term effect in curbing prices temporarily, but if such measures and prohibitions remain for a long period of time, that may lead to negative consequences and to a much greater inflationary pressure. That is why you need to have permanent, predictable market kind of mechanisms with respect to the goods where the probability is strong, as well as volatility is continuous. I mean, when the prices jump up and down, particularly in as far as the food products are concerned. And unequivocally, my opinion is that these should be the market response measures and not the administrative ones. The next question comes from Maria Stepanova from TASS. Yes, good afternoon. I've got a question about the subsidized lending. You said that that program may continue in 24 regions. My question is, have you discussed this issue with the government, and specifically with the Ministry of Construction? And is it possible that this list may be shortened? But if the program is extended, for how long? Thank you. Well, we forwarded our position to the government, and we hope to discuss it. We proposed various criteria, which can be discussed, as well as the number of regions. In our mind, the main criterion, first thing, we believe that the program, if to remain for no longer than the end of this year, in this particular case, if it is to be extended in a limited number of regions, and first and foremost in the kind of regions where subsidized mortgage lending didn't lead into any volatile effects, both in terms of the availability of housing falling and the price for housing starting to grow and the mortgage bubble emerging. So one of the factors is housing pricing in different regions. Another possible criteria, the availability of housing supply. This is debatable, as well as the list of regions, and so we're ready to enter into it. That question comes from Alexei Bogomolov, RBK from Vologda. The Vologda region wasn't put into the list of regions where the subsidized mortgage lending is to be extended. The experts believe that if it is cut down, the pricing for housing will grow and the demand for housing will fall, and the developers' numbers have dwindled after the escrow accounts have been introduced. What is the central bank forecast for the majority of the regions which may not end up being in the list? Well, first of all, the final decision hasn't yet been made in terms of how the subsidized lending mortgage program will continue. We submitted our proposals, and the list of regions that we included into it, corresponds to the criteria which we proposed, but the criteria can be discussed. Once again, I shall repeat that these are the principles for us which are important, based on which the program is continued, and you should agree that the main idea behind the subsidized lending mortgage program is to help people buy housing. If it simply transforms into the price growth, even against low interest rates, when the housing price continues to grow, people can't have it as an affordable something. So this must be taken into account. As far as the Vologda region is concerned, let me take a quick look here. So the Vologda region. Yes, the Vologda region, the prices for housing in the primary market, if you measure it through the Q4 2020 and compare it to Q4 2019, have grown slightly above the average, not very high, whereas average in Russia prices last year for primary housing grew by 12%. You should agree This is much higher than inflation. This is double-digit price growth, which is too much. So Vologda region demonstrate prices growing by 12.4%. So this is something that demands attention and the discussion. So in any case, we believe that even after the anti-crisis, large-scale mortgage support programs are over, there should remain continuous targeted programs specifically for purpose-specific categories of the people, maybe not even the regions, but just the cities and townships where the developers are not interested in building anything, I mean, specifically the housing. So you quite correctly pointed this out, because there are regions where the profit margins in the construction projects is not attractive to the developers. If you act specifically on the market conditions, government support is required in order for the housing to develop, and so that people may have an opportunity to buy their own housing. So very purpose-specific programs should be put in place, and depending upon the different regional situations as well as the different municipal and local situations, so as to promote the availability of housing for the Russian citizens. Next question comes from Anna Kaledina from Izvestia. In your press release, it says that the demand has strengthened because of the spending concentrated domestically, because people are not traveling abroad. Is there any specific value that you can put your finger on in terms of how much money was spent inside the country? Well, there aren't any specific estimates, and based on different indicators we're trying to understand, a certain part went into savings, of course, and another part was spent domestically, I mean, for the domestic tourism. Not only that, let's say this money has been saved, and it could have been spent to buy durable goods and to have very specific data in terms of where this part of money was spent amongst the people who traditionally went abroad but couldn't travel this year. But you could say that 2 trillion rubles were not spent abroad. So they were either put into the savings or were spent domestically, and in this way supported domestic demand. Next questions comes from Ekaterina Litva, V Times. What are the message of the fiscal policy could reduce the rate of key rate rising? Is there any discussion of that with the Minister of Finance, for example, reducing the borrowing plans, the fiscal deficit, and so on and so forth, taking into account that 2021 is the election year, parliamentary election year? What kind of influence in terms of the fiscal part of it you may foresee for the 2021? More in neutral, disinflationary, or inflationary? Well, our base forecast has whatever has been written into the main guidelines of the fiscal policy presented by the Minister of Finance, and without doubt, as data comes covering what will happen to the budget, we will reflect it. So there was information that possibly the borrowing plan may be reduced, but we understand that the deficit level won't change. It's simply going to be funded not through the borrowing, but through the whatever remains because of the oil and gas revenue and the extent to which it turned out to be above the plan. So it's going to be neutral if the deficit part of it stays as is. So we would watch all of this, and in the meantime, we act upon what has been put into the budget. And the basic thing is that the fiscal policy is defined by the parameters of the fiscal rule that we're coming back to in 2021, and nobody doubts it. Next question from Pavel Kazarnovsky from RBK. To what extent the reduction of rate in 2020 speeded up the inflation? Is it possible to measure this effect? To what extent the key rate affects the inflation in the current environment? And are there any stronger factors? Well, in the end of the day, the key rate does affect inflation. And specifically by changing the key rate, by changing the direction of the monetary policy, we're able to control inflation, to manage it, and with the help of the key rate instrument, we're able to keep midterm outlook the inflation close to the target. So undoubtedly, the current inflation may be affected by various one-off factors. So we set up our monetary policy in order to achieve our inflation targets, and currently we see that the one-off factors in the way the inflation currently is comprised of, these one-off factors do make a stronger contribution in making the current inflation deviate from 4%. Next question from Andrei Buriko, Bloomberg. Once again, good afternoon. In your statement, you mentioned that the data points to the need to raise the key rate now so as not to raise it any more later, and that, amongst other things, you considered to raise it by 50 basis points. Does it mean that the basic part of the monetary policy changes you plan to shift towards the second quarter, and should we expect any further rise in April? It will all depend upon the situation. The pace and the period within which our transition towards the neutral monetary policy is going to take place. It will all depend upon the situation and the extent to which these changes may affect our outlook. I'm not in a position to tell you anything more than that, because there are many different directional trends and factors, and yes, we have signaled saying that we do not rule out that the key rate may be further raised during the subsequent meetings. It all is situational. I will emphasize that we began going back to the neutral monetary policy because the current situation requires it. Tatiana Chubaiso from Interfax. Hello. Yes, good afternoon. I've got several questions. The first one, when the central bank is planning to return to the discussion of differentiated markups in terms of the adequacy of capital in the systemic banks, because it has been delayed because of the pandemic, and the central bank, we remember, put it into its agenda for 2021. In other banks with the administration of the bank, because when Equity Bank was being administered, its debt was written off, and the holders were the foreign entities who, in January 2021, came out with a class act, and they're trying to contest in court these write-offs. To what extent the central bank believes that they stand a good chance, and will it be an obstacle for the sale of the Equity Bank, which is planned for next year? Another question is related to the currency deposits. Considering statistics from the currency deposits, there was about 9 billion of currency cash withdrawn. Half of that was acquisition of the non-cash currency with the subsequent withdrawal of cash. So how do you assess this change of the structure in savings, and does it make sense to reduce the income tax on the currency deposit, because that would incentivize people not to keep their money in their mattresses but take it to the bank? Thank you. All right, as far as the differentiated rate is concerned, with respect to the systemic credit institutions, indeed, because of the pandemic, we postponed this measure until 2021, but we're going to discuss it, as well as we'll discuss the time frame and the extent to which this differentiation should be started. As far as the subordinates are concerned and the writing off of it, it was done in accordance with this legislation. The court shall consider it, but we would refrain from assessing any chance. And it is not standing in the way to prepare the Equity Bank for the sale. We confirm our plans to start selling it in 2022. Now, as far as the currency deposits and accounts are concerned, we haven't discussed the currency rate changes because reducing the currency component is one of our priorities, because we do see that during the pandemic various preferences changed in the first place in terms of the savings and consumptions and the form of savings, because of the key rate being reduced, and and the stock market and the savings and the cash. This is a global trend, and that has been dictated by the pandemic. So we'll watch over the way the situation continues to develop, because the households have the possibility to keep their savings in rubles, and that is being conducive by our positive rates. The next question comes from a moderator, Stachana Burova, the regional Gazette, Ekaterinburg. Many financial institutions offer loans to the households despite a high debt burden indicator and a poor credit history, which leads to overburdening of the households with the debt and creates a prerequisite for the bankruptcy and loss of property. What measures need to be undertaken in order for the banks to be interested to refuse lending to those who have previously been burdened by borrowings and debts? Well, it is a very, indeed, important thing. So we undertake such measures in order to de-incentivize the banks when trying to consider issuing loans to the households who have been already burdened by loans and debts. So we have introduced the markup percentages whenever there's a big risk like that. But of course, some of the banks have the ability to reflect such risk ratios and related markups and continue lending. We have analyzed the global practices. In the global practices, there are other instruments that are being used apart from the ones that we are using here. Like the higher risk ratio markups, and specifically the quantitative limitation, because in some countries there could be a direct ban on giving a loan to a household which is overburdened by debts, or banks institute special quotas for a certain amount of such loans. We don't have such an entitlement by law, so we're currently talking to the government in order for us to be given such a legal right so that we could use it. Thank you. Will there be any more questions, please? Rita Shpilevskaya from TASS. Yes, good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. Dear Elvira Nabiullina, I've got two questions. A very quick one. First, does the central bank consider to review any other macro economic forecast apart from the ones that you've told us? And second, in the recent central bank report about the floating rates, there was a bit of a phrase which said the qualified borrower. I'd like to understand whether there is a need to introduce this particular notion to the market right now, and what kind of preferences such a qualified borrower may be entitled to. Well, in April, we're going to review the macroeconomic forecast as is. We will do it in April, and so the trends, there are different trends, including the inflationary trend, like we've mentioned, really point to this forecast being made more specific, because all of the indicators are interrelated, so we'll share it with you in April. Now, in as far as the floating rates are concerned and the possibility of introducing a category of qualified borrowers similar to the qualified investors, this is the issue to discuss. We cannot say that we are leaning towards something more strongly and plan to introduce such a category. I have my personal doubts. I believe that first we need to take a look at how this delineation between the qualified and non-qualified investors may play out, because it needs to be tested, and we need to take a look how it all comes to, because considering the organizations which are interested in promoting and selling their products to investors, and so if we are to introduce qualified investor category, there also could be certain complications. So I do not think that this is the primary instrument or this is the primary area for us to regulate and restrict the risks related to floating rates. We will see what experts might come back to us with in the marketplace, because we're currently going through a debate. Next question from Ivan Shligin from FOMAG.ru. Elvira Nabiullina, good afternoon. My question is this. It's about the government measures related to the price regulations. You've spoken about it, but I would like to ask you whether it is possible to estimate the kind of a contribution that these measures so far have produced. Is it tangible? Is it possible to see it, or this kind of contribution hasn't yet produced any effect? Well, there is a contribution from these measures. But without doubt, it depends upon the basket share representing the goods that prices for which are being regulated. So we assess this contribution as maybe 0.1, 0.2 percentage points. But with that, one should also bear in mind that the goods for which prices grew considerably, they are quite sensitive to households, and they do promote high inflationary expectations, which we see that first they have grown somewhat, but then went down, but still remain at quite a high level. The next question from Irina Chichurina, Russian Gazette from Samara. The acceleration of inflation in Russia over the past several months have been above 5%, as being deemed by many experts is being conditioned by a weaker ruble. Does the central bank plan to undertake any measures to strengthen the ruble rather than just work on a rate? And what central bank intends to undertake in order to bring inflation into the targeted range of 4%? Because the rate is impossible to reduce endlessly. Well, as you can see, we didn't lower the rate, we raised it. And of course, the ruble exchange rate impacts inflation, but I would like to say that this inflation in terms of the changes in the ruble exchange rate is much lower than what we may recall was the fact several years ago. Based on our estimates, the depreciation of ruble by 10%, which is considerable depreciation, may produce the additional annual inflation by 0.5, 0.6 percentage points. In the past, that was double that amount. Now, the weakening of the exchange rate that occurred last year, its contribution into inflation was 1 percentage point, according to our estimates. And its effect, the depreciation of the ruble, this effect has been fully considered in the prices, and so currently the inflation is being impacted by other factors. In the first place, this is very actively rebounding external and domestic demand, as well as some negative supply factors. Now, in as far as the exchange rate itself is concerned, certainly many, including the businesses and the household, are interested in a much more stable exchange rate dynamics. The stability of the exchange rate, and this exchange rate stability is very much dependent upon the fiscal rules, so we believe it is important in 2022 to go back to the fiscal rule parameters and the fact of the low inflation itself, because when inflation is low in a stable way, then, of course, various exchange rate fluctuations may take place because of the external factors, but if you take several years for the time slot, the exchange rate may remain within the stable range. But different artificial measures to support the exchange rate, whenever there are objective factors which should lead to an objective weakening, an attempt to support the exchange rate artificially, that may produce a short-lived lower inflation, but longer term that may result in a greater depreciation of the ruble and a stronger inflation. So we believe that target inflation, with the help of the monetary policy and the key rate and the floating exchange rate, are the measures which will help to see a much more stable inflation, and in the end of the day, together with the fiscal rule, provide for a much more stable dynamics. Next question comes from Roman Markella from Russian Gazette. And in as far as the stability of the Russian financial market, so this additional $2 trillion US dollars of the US fiscal stimulus, how that may be affected, what do you believe is the main threat to the stability of the Russian financial market? Well, I previously mentioned about how the new economic stimulus package initiated by the US may affect us against the backdrop of the US economy actively recovering. So there are stronger expectations in the financial markets with respect to the inflationary pressure growing, which, amongst other things, was reflected in the better treasury yields in the long end, also the financial market fluctuations as risks are not being dismissed in terms of the inflow-outflow in the emerging economies. We need to take it all into account. Now, in terms of what is the biggest threat to the stability of the Russian financial market these days, I mean, we do regular review of the risks, financial risks, and we believe that we analyze the external and domestic factors, and our main task is to monitor in advance such possible risks emerging, and we've got the necessary toolkit in order to act. Now, in terms of any express risks, we don't see them. Now, the next question comes from Ekaterina Litova from V Times. From the beginning of the year, the government bond yield curve grew dramatically. How it may translate into the lending of economy, and what may be done in order to slow it down by the central bank. Well, it's true that the government bond curve grew within the short span, as well as in terms of the midterm and long-term outlooks. Well, the nature behind this is different, because in the short-term one, yes, it comes from the changes in the key rate, and that we are going to revert back to the neutral fiscal policy, but with respect to the long-term government bond maturity, that is being affected by the global rates being changed. So we take it all into account in order to assess the fiscal terms and conditions and the way they may affect, because this is one of the drivers which we are cognizant of whenever we define a possible trajectory of the way the fiscal policy, the way the monetary policy may evolve into the future. As far as I understand, that has been the last question. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.